Welcome to Key Talking Points.
The podcast that makes learning effortless.
No fluff, no jargon, just clear, engaging explanations.
We break down complex topics so you don't have to.
Let's get straight to the point.
Visit keytalkingpoints.com for more. So, here's a question that sounds completely upside down. How is it possible that in Cuba, a taxi driver earns more in a single day than a doctor does in an entire month?
It's baffling, really, but when you start breaking it down, it all comes back to Cuba's unique economic system. A taxi driver can make about $60 in a day, while the average monthly salary for doctors is just $25. $25.
Wait, what? $25 for a month of work?
Exactly, and the reason boils down to how different sectors of the Cuban economy operate. You see, taxi services are part of a semi-privatized economy, which allows drivers to set their own prices and earn higher incomes. Meanwhile, doctors, like many other professionals, work in the state-controlled public sector, where wages are tightly regulated and, unfortunately, very low.
This brings us right to what people call Cuba's upside-down economy. Basically, jobs that require the least skill, like driving a taxi or waiting tables, can end up being the most lucrative, while highly skilled work, like medicine or engineering, is underpaid.
And if you trace it back, a big turning point was the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Before that, Cuba was heavily subsidized by the USSR, which propped up its communist economy. When those subsidies disappeared, well, everything changed.
Right. Cuba had no choice but to introduce rationing systems, and the economy began unraveling in a way that's left people scrambling to survive. I mean, people literally shifted professions to escape the economic stranglehold of low government wages.
You've got stories of engineers turning into cooks, teachers waiting tables, and professors selling
Constitution copies?
Yes, exactly. These are people trained for intensely skilled work, but driven into less regulated sectors, where there's actually a chance to make a living. That's where privatization plays its part. Those small, private markets that are outside government control often become lifelines.
And when you mix that with basic economics, supply and demand, it makes sense. In Cuba, sectors like tourism and taxis are the only spaces where people can set competitive rates, and the demand for their services from tourists is always high.
It's a stark example of how incentives shape behaviour. Skilled professionals aren't rewarded for their training or hard work, so they're pivoting to these less regulated industries for a better income. The bigger picture, it paints a pretty bleak view of economic and social mobility in Cuba.
The collapse of the Soviet Union wasn't just a crack in the system. It was like pulling the rug out from under Cuba's entire economy. And that's where everything begins to unravel, right?
Exactly. With no more Soviet subsidies, their entire system had to adjust. People started rationing goods and, more importantly, the government maintained control over wages for most sectors. But then small pockets of privatization began to emerge. And that's really when things started shifting.
Right. Like today, Cuba's private economy is only about 20% of the total. But even with that small slice, it's created these massive income gaps. You've got people in privatized sectors like taxi drivers doing way better than professionals.
It's survival, honestly. For many families, the so-called black market has become a lifeline. You've got teachers and scientists moonlighting as street vendors or offering private services. Anything they can do to bring in cash under the radar.
And it's not just services, it's goods too. Like people literally selling everything from homemade food to, phone parts just to get by. It's wild how informal these channels have become.
Here's a typical example. A Cuban doctor might spend their morning seeing patients in a government clinic, earning just $30, maybe $40 a month. But once their shift ends, they're out driving a cab to make real money.
Crazy, isn't it?
It is, it's just so backwards. And what's even more frustrating is how limited their options are within the official economy. Doctors, teachers, engineers, they're some of the most skilled workers, yet they're stuck with salaries that don't reflect their training or contributions.
Whereas someone in the private sector, like a taxi driver, can set their own prices and work directly with tourists, who are always willing to pay more. It's a no-brainer why people are leaving their professions.
And then there's this ripple effect. overregulation on one side, paired with privatization on the other, just keeps pulling the economy further apart. Skilled professionals feel like their aspirations and hard work are pointless. Why train for years when driving a cab makes more sense financially?
Yeah, it's such a stark contradiction. The very sectors that are supposed to uphold a country, healthcare, education, engineering, are being gutted of talent. And those same workers, they've found their way to tourism and taxis because that's where the money is.
It all comes back to incentives, doesn't it? I mean, when professionals decide to leave their fields for tourism or taxis, it's because financially and socially, that choice just makes the most sense for them, given the circumstances.
Exactly. And when the system distorts those incentives, well, you get what we've been talking about. Skilled professionals switching to completely unrelated jobs just to make ends meet.
Right, like why would anyone put in years of grueling medical training when driving a taxi earns 10 times as much? It's like the system punishes ambition.
And that's where the economic principles come in. If the rewards don't match the effort or skill invested, people naturally shift to alternatives. Cuba's a prime example of how centralized control can erode the very idea of empowerment.
Empowerment, that's the word. I mean, what we're seeing with these small pockets of privatization, like the taxi industry, is that they give people a chance to take control of their own lives, even if it's barely scratching the surface of real reform.
But it's such a double-edged sword, isn't it? On one hand, privatization is helping individuals survive. On the other, it's creating these stark inequalities that didn't exist before. The wealth gap in Cuba is growing even within its tiny private sector.
Totally. And we can't forget how fragile it all is. The government still controls so much, and these grey areas of private enterprise could be shut down at any moment. For the people relying on them, that's a scary reality.
And it's a gamble, really. Investing in a private business, even something as simple as getting a taxi license, can be a huge risk. But for many, it's the only viable path to a better life.
It's such a contrast. In countries where privatization is widespread, places like the US or parts of Europe, economic growth and individual progress generally go hand in hand. Sure, those systems aren't perfect, but they show what's possible when incentives line up properly.
Exactly. It's about creating an ecosystem where effort is rewarded fairly and where people feel their talents and contributions actually matter. I think Cuba's gradual reforms under Raul Castro scratched the surface of this, but they didn't go far enough.
Totally. It's like laying down a single plank across a river when you really need a full bridge. Those reforms created cracks in the system, but didn't address the bigger structural problems: economic volatility, inequality, the lack of true freedom to innovate.
And let's not forget the human cost. Doctors, scientists, teachers, these are people with so much potential to contribute to society. But instead, they're trapped in a system that devalues their work. It's heartbreaking, really.
It is. And it makes you wonder, what would Cuba look like? What could it accomplish if all those talented individuals had the freedom to fully thrive, to start their own businesses, earn fair wages, maybe even innovate on a global scale?
It's a fascinating question. I mean, there are glimpses of it in the entrepreneurship we've already discussed. People finding ways to work around the system, using their skills to survive.
But survival isn't enough, is it? Empowerment is so much more than that. It's about enabling people to not just live, but to achieve, to dream and to grow. And when you take that away, like we've seen in Cuba, you strip away a society's potential.
Which brings us back to incentives. It's not just about economics. It's about hope, about giving people a reason to believe that their efforts will actually pay off. Without that, progress becomes almost impossible.
And on that note, maybe that's the real lesson here. For governments, for individuals, for all of us, incentives matter. Empowerment matters. People need to feel that their contributions, no matter how big or small, are valued. Because when they don't, well, we've seen the consequences.
And that's all for today. Thanks for joining us in unpacking Cuba's economic paradox. It's been such an eye-opener.
Absolutely. Until next time, take care and keep asking questions.